السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. عاملين إيه؟ إيه أخباركم؟ يا رب دايما تكونوا بخير وأشوفكم دايما بخير يا رب. إن شاء الله دلوقتي هنبتدي نعرض فيديوهات مهمة جدا لبلندر في الموديلنج بتاعها لما تيجي تعمل موديلنج لبلندر. أوكي؟ يا رب تعجبكم يا رب وإن شاء الله تستفادوا جدا. يلا بينا توكلنا على الله.
Hey, Gleb and 80 here with the introduction video for 50 modeling issues from Hell, the ultimate troubleshooting tips collection for 3D modelers.
Let's take a look at the teaser and then we'll come back and we'll explore it further. If you just started with 3D modeling, you've probably realized by now that many things can go off the rails.
Even if you feel more or less comfortable with 3D modeling in general, there are always more things that can spoil the fun.
We definitely know that there are some techniques that we need to give special mention to, many thanks to your blends and emails and the general feedback that we get. And that allows us to really focus in on these same issues that crop up again and again.
So we're gonna name a few common modeling issues and let's see if anything from that list rings true for you. Ready?
A subdivided object collapses into a hopeless mess. The topology going haywire because you did something awful.
Non-manifold geometry drives people nuts, usually booleans are to blame, and flipping normals doesn't help.
Boolean ops seems to be the most efficient way to ruin the topology. Blender text remeshing turns out to produce meshes that can't be properly beveled.
Models explode due to some mistake in operating the modifier stack, or they can do it on render.
Bevels overshooting like hell, or not working at all.
The models exported to other software or to game engines just look ridiculous.
Want to see more?
Subdivision pinching resulting in garbage geometry and shading, self-intersections, subdivision surfaces looking like pancakes.
Heavy meshes that are so heavy it takes ages to move just a single vertex. Hello, photoscans. Poles twist shading.
Or it's just glitchy, and go figure.
Or finally, Blender just crashes and you lose all progress. It happens to Blender too. If you can relate to anything on this very brief list of modeling issues from hell, and at the same time you don't want to spend countless millions of hours on YouTube searching through various tutorial channels like ours for example, or Stack Exchange forums, you name it, then this video course is going to be for you. We believe it is the ultimate collection of the most common and some wild and rare 3D modeling issues that you're most likely to encounter.
Even though the number 50 has been mentioned, actually it's more than 80 mini tutorials that are available right off the bat, and there will be more to come.
Assorted chocolates of 3D modeling quick tips ranging from topology to glitch fixing. So these are chocolates you do know what you're going to get thanks to the full table of contents for this course on the Trello page we created and going to be updating for this purpose. Edges between the ends, well, we can see that averaging going on. The main takeaway then is that we need to spend some time creating some extra edges if we hope to preserve any sharp features. That isn't strictly true because we can use our creasing by selecting edges and pressing Shift E and then pressing 1 for a full value, but we might feel that's too sharp, and if we lower our creasing value again using Shift E, then again we're not quite getting the result we might want. Again, especially with the cylinder, because we aren't relegating those curvy sections to a more flatter, safer areas, as you can see on the version with the deliberate support loops. So with these details in mind, let's throw it back to Gleb to see how we might be able to salvage our subdivision squid that we got before.
Simply speaking, this type of geometry isn't a good fit for subdividing, but that doesn't necessarily mean we cannot subdivide the part of this mesh. So for example, here I'm going to add a bunch of loop cuts with the loop cut tool, and after doing this, to smooth out the resulting geometry, I will select those edges and the edges on the other side, and I will go right click Loop Tools while making sure that I have activated this add-on, and I will select Relax, and I will repeat the procedure a few times to smooth out those edges. We can increase the number of iterations if we would like to. So that's the first way out of this modeling hell. Just work on the part of the mesh using the good old standard modeling toolset of Blender. Then we can probably alternatively experiment with the bevel modifier if we want to round some edges like that. The subdivision surface modifier is a great way of approaching different modeling tasks, but it's not the only way.
And I'm just gonna jump back in again here with the main takeaway, which is that whatever approach we choose, if we want to retain our sharp edges on a model that we want to use the subdivision modifier on, so for example, we really want those more realistic corners, then in that case, we need to be adding some supporting loops either side of the original sharply angled edges. This is why the bevel modifier is a good option, but it won't work in every case, which is why sometimes, in some especially hellish cases, we need to get in there and fix up the topology with not manic knife wielding, but carefully considered splicing and dicing of the topology, which we'll be getting our hands much dirtier with later on in the course. So until then, please stay safe.
Whoa, that's a bad, giant, inflatable snail made of N-gons.
Sometimes when cutting a groove into some geometry, we might find that the resulting loop isn't so easy to select. And if we want to quickly change the depth of this groove or delete it altogether, then first we're going to need to be able to select it. And in this case, my edge loop selection tool doesn't allow me to select the whole loop. This one, Alt left click, easy peasy. From this side of the plane all the way to the other side of the plane, no problem. But since this one has these poles here, so if I Alt left click on here, it's going to terminate just at this point as it gets mightily confused between whether to turn left or right. And similarly here with this junction. So typically these junctions are called poles, so vertices that don't just simply have 4 edges sprouting from them. So we might call this one a 3-pole, and this one over here is a 5-pole, thanks to these 5 edges merging from it. So again here, if I press 2 to switch to edge select and Alt left click here, you can see it's not really sure whether to go down here or down here. It's not a huge problem in this case since we don't have a lot of poles, so we could just go Alt left click and then Shift Alt left click and then Shift Alt left click again, and now we have the whole loop. But if we had a lot of this staking around and it was a much more complicated mesh, then this might take some time. This is a simple enough solution though. We can just break out our select shortest path tool. So first we select our first edge and then simply Control left click on the final edge in that loop. And then typically with our default settings, we're going to get our whole loop. If the way the groove that's been cut in can't easily allow you to add support loops, then how should we go about it? Well, after we've selected the edge loop that has the pole junctions on with our pick shortest path tool, we can then press X and then delete edge loops. And it's as if it never existed in the first place. But I'm going to conjure that back into existence with Control Z and then plunge this loop into the depths a little bit with G and then Z so that we can just illustrate another point. So maybe you were thinking, this doesn't actually sound very hellish, just a little selection issue. But stay wary, traveller, for this road promises darker shadows will fall. That is to say, this is a kind of portent, a warning of things to come. So say, for example, we intend to use the subdivision surface modifier with this. I'm going to left click and drag across those to enable it in our view there. Tab into object mode for a cleaner view on that for a second. So with the subdivision surface modifier, one of the advantages of the good topology here for the subdivision modifier is easy selection. So if that's not working for us, there's probably more hell to encounter down the road. So for example, if we wanted to add support loops and tighten the corners here, then let's tab into edit mode and try and press Control R and left click in a loop there, we can see that actually our path is leading away from the main road and off into the moors. All right, exactly. So that right there is those darker shadows mentioned earlier. So let's rewind back to the start and quickly recreate that groove. All right, so with this subdivided plane here, let's switch over to Material Preview, or Look Dev as it was once known, just so that this doesn't blend so much into the background. And then what I'm going to do is press C to enter into our circle select, and then left click and drag across the edges that we want to snake our geometry through, and then right click and then just subdivide, and then we've almost got it. In fact, I can alt left click on this and get the loop. But just to keep it all quad and get rid of these triangles here and these n-gons here, I'm going to take those two edges and then also subdivide those. Right click, subdivide. Pressing 1 to enter into our vertex select, we can see we've got extra vertices there, and I can join them with J, and similar there. And then just to smooth it off a little bit, I'm just going to press G and then G again to slide. And then somewhere around there, let's just round it off to 0.2. I'm going to type in 0.2 and enter. And then same with this vertex, I'm going to select it, G and then G again, slide down this edge, and then 0.2 and enter. All right, so we're back where we were with this loop, and we're all quads. We're in vertex select at the moment, but our shortest path tool will still work. I'll just select that vertex and then control left click here, and then we've got the whole loop. So earlier, the issue was just being a little too gung-ho, a bit too happy to pull the trigger when declaring our groove geometry fit for purpose. So before we drag this stuff down, we need to first just bevel this loop we've made. So I'm going to go Control B and create now this face loop instead. But I'm going to scroll the mouse wheel just to add an extra loop in the middle there. And then we'll just left click and just confirm all that. If I press 3 to switch into face select mode and just alt left click on this edge here, we can now select face loops easily enough. Or in edge select mode, we can obviously just alt and left click on that loop and get it easy peasy, just as we could with these over there. Since we've pushed the position of our poles just away from our main edge loop now. So let's G and then Z and drop that down, enable our modifier. And now if we wanted to tighten up the curve of this particular corner here, it'd be really easy. We just go Control R, and now our newly created loop follows the geometry perfectly. I'm not actually going to quite do that, so I'm going to undo that with Control Z though, and instead I'm going to do one either side of this current loop that we have selected by using our offset edge tool. So I'm going to go Control Shift and R, and I just move the cursor till they're both quite high. We can turn off all our overlays with this button just to see that a bit clearer, or we can do that with Shift Alt and Z. And now we've generally got way better control over our loops. So now I can simply Alt left click this one, press G a couple of times to start sliding, and we can change the fall off or the general design of this groove. It's a little bit clearer to see without all the overlay again, so Shift Alt Z, double tap G, and then we can see that changing, whether we want to make it tighter at the bottom or tighter at the top. And that I leave to you.
I have this weird modeling issue, my mesh is flickering like this. What's going on? In computer graphics, this phenomenon is called Z-fighting. It occurs when two polygons share the same depth value or Z value. They kind of struggle for our attention and for the order in which they should be drawn on screen. It's nearly impossible to determine which one should be drawn first because of this Z-depth conflict. So that's precisely what's happening with your mesh. Here you can see that we have two objects sitting on top of each other. So maybe you accidentally duplicated the mesh or something like that. We can just go ahead and delete the duplicate geometry. So we fixed it on the object level in this case, but sometimes polygons overlap, say, in the edit mode. On the elements level, overlapping polygons can be pretty tricky to spot, but once you did it, you can confirm it by dragging some vertices around, and you can see that clearly something wrong is going on here. Selecting and deleting the extra geometry by hand is not very efficient, so let's go A to select all polygons, and right-click, merge vertices, merge by distance. And hopefully the overlapping elements will be found and removed. So we have just removed 44 vertices, not bad, but we can set the merge distance a little bit higher and see what happens. Whoa, by having the merge distance set a little bit higher, we removed almost 1,000 extra vertices. Because hey, I had set up this example, so I just duplicated everything once again in advance. So watch out for those polygons having that fight. There is a seam that won't go away no matter what I do. So right away we can see a few seams that look pretty problematic over here. One of them is caused by the floating edges around here, and the other kind of a paneling effect or seam is caused by the geometry that is detached from the main mesh. In other words, while it follows the curvature of the main mesh, there are edges that are disconnected from it. You think, hey, that's an easy fix. Let's jump to vertices selection mode, press A, and just merge all vertices by distance. Bam, 24 vertices removed, and pretty much all the seams are gone, except this one. And what is interesting, when you try to grab and move some vertices around, it behaves in kind of a normal way. Anyway, let's investigate it further by jumping into the viewport shading panel and enabling the X-ray checkbox. Now the problem manifested itself, right? There is a face, an interior face causing the shading artifacts, and on top of that, it's extremely tricky to select. But I managed to do it. That being said, the more optimal way would be to go select all by trait, interior faces. And Blender can give us a hand in selecting this non-manifold outlier, so we can just delete it and enjoy the clean geometry without any seams. But let's have a look at a little bit different example with two interior faces inside this cube. So if we follow our own footsteps and select the interior faces and delete those faces, it will carve a huge hole in the mesh because the selection was a little bit too ambitious. Let's try something else. Select all by trait, and then go non-manifold. Just make sure that you are in the edge selection mode. Now the selection is perfect, only the non-manifold or non-solid geometry was selected, so we can get rid of it. No more mysterious seams. You know, generating interior faces, even by chance, can lead to unforeseen consequences. It can make all the difference in the world. Oh, you won't believe that, but apparently I noticed that my spheres have wrinkles, as if you're looking at the planet Earth North Pole, and instead of the North Pole you see wrinkles. Well, that is strange, and to the contrary of what we may have thought intuitively, enabling subdivision surface modifier didn't smooth things out. Actually, the wrinkles became even more pronounced. And if we push it over the top and add this simple deform modifier and twist our mesh a little bit, you'll notice the extreme version of this effect. There are matcaps in Blender that may help to emphasize and to debug it. For example, the matcap with vertical stripes. So yeah, this configuration of polygons, which is typical for UV spheres, unlike geospheres, lead to pinching around the poles, which is not always bad. Let's put things straight, but sometimes it may lead to confusion. For example, if you want to add Gribble to your mesh or something like that, and you expect it to behave in a more or less uniform way. So here, for example, I selected a bunch of polygons randomly and extruded them inwards. Right away, we can notice that at the top of the sphere, we have this strange configuration that may or may not be what you want to achieve, but chances are that we may prefer to have something more uniform there. So as the saying goes, the best spheres are made from cubes. So let's add a cube to our scene and then just throw in the subdivision surface modifier on top of that cube. That will effectively turn it into a sphere. Well, we have to add the cast modifier on top of it and set the factor to 1, or with the sphere selected as the cast type, and that will spherify our subdivided cube. Well, we could have applied the modifiers first and then spherify the geometry by hand, but anyway. Shade smooth now and remove the circular guide that I have added in advance. And now, ladies and gentlemen, this is officially a sphere. But unlike the UV sphere, it doesn't have problems around the poles, it doesn't have wrinkles, because the topology is distributed in a completely different manner. So voila, while there are applications for both types of the topology, oftentimes spherified cubes make better spheres. And if you want to learn more about poles and topology in general, check out the chapters related to poles, or data transfer chapters for that matter.
Let's start with what they are. So poles are vertices that don't have four edges coming from them. So the inside of a typical grid is pole free. All of these vertices here, as you can see, have four edges coming from them. Where we will find poles is whenever we try to direct polygonal flow. It's easy to direct the polygonal flow by, for example, insetting. So I'm just pressing I to inset this selection here. And here now we can see this 5-pole and this 3-pole at each corner. We can create poles by merging opposite vertices together like this, Alt-M at center. And now we have this 6-pole bordered by these two 3-poles. Or we can take an edge and just Control E to bring up our edges menu, and then either of these rotate edge options will work. And so this looks a little bit more natural. Let's just smooth these guys. So Control V, smooth vertices. I'm going to take that all the way up with a few repeats. That'll do. And with those poles, notice all the changes in directional flow now. And it's not that tricky to actually move them around either. So let's find a 5-pole like this one here. And all we need to do is just take two of the legs. And the way I kind of visualize these 5 poles anyway is kind of like a head with 2 arms and 2 legs, depending on how you've orientated it to you. Let's just say the active one is the head at the moment. So I'm going to take the 2 legs, or rather the ends of them, the end vertices, and then just go Alt-M and merge them together. And again here, Alt-M to merge them to the center. And we're going to see we're moving that, we're shifting it further and further away from the original position it was in. You'll often find that 3 and 5 poles are actually almost inevitable if we need our topology to change direction anyway, but we tend to try to avoid anything 6-pole and above. Since poles control direction, a 6-pole might be an indication that just too many face loops are depending on that vertex. That might make further editing tricky, as so much of the mesh will be relying on that vertex, and it's more likely to cause artifacts if it's animated too. Though usually in hard surface modeling, that's not going to be an issue. Poles that are on flat surfaces, from a shading point of view, we don't worry about them. But if it's not a flat surface, then pretty much any kind of pole tends to create artifacts in a form of warping in the shading. So here I've got this just flat grid, essentially, no poles. I have another object here, which is also flat, but this time we've got far more 5 poles in there, and 3 poles for that matter. And then I have another mesh here, which is just flat, which has got a lot of 6 poles and 3 poles, just by contrast. And what I'm going to do is give all of those the exact same displacement. But first, I'm just going to run it through a subdivision surface modifier. And then once we're with that, we have another subdivision surface modifier. So since the displace modifier is exactly the same on all of these, which I'm going to enable, we can see that when we switch between them, they're pretty much occupying the exact same space. And I've got a camera up here, so we're going to look through that so we can preserve this point of view. I'm going to switch off the wireframe and we'll see that again. We've switched to the 5-pole, and this is the one with no poles. Now, as you can see, pretty much they all look pretty good, and this is a pretty shiny matte cap. So really a lot of this relies on common sense. If you've got a very grungy material, very rough and dirty, then probably you're not really going to have these sorts of warping really creating much of an issue for you. Should you be doing something which is reliant on hyper shiny surfaces, then it's just worth bearing this in mind. We have a kind of matte cap which is excellent for really managing some extreme analysis of our warping on the mesh. So here we have our perfect quads, and you can see most of this is perfectly smooth. But if we go to our lots of 5 poles version, we'll see quite a lot of that distortion happening where it probably shouldn't. And exactly the same happens with the 6 poles. And even from this view, without seeing the wireframe, we can pretty much analyze where those poles are. So for example, there's one here and there's one here. And to toggle the wireframe, you can see what we mean. There's the 6 pole and there's another 6 pole. And just to drill the message home, let's switch to the 5 poles and toggle the wireframe. And again, in those places where we see that exceptional amount of warping, that's where we're pretty much going to get those issues. It's also worth noting that since our perfect quad version is so good, we can actually just take our version with lots of poles, like this one, and just add a shrink wrap modifier to it, which is targeted to that perfect one. And if we enable that now, we'll see a lot of that warping all go away. So here's the before and there's the after. And remember, this is an extremely harsh and unforgiving matcap. Here I've got another example, which is just to demonstrate that typically the more edges that we've got converging into a single vertex. So in this case, we have 16 edges converging into this vertex, so a 16 pole. And in this case, we're not only going to get more warping in the shading, we're more likely to get a kind of pinching too. So I've got my proportional editing on there, so I'm just going to raise this up and just create a little bit of a pattern, I suppose, a little undulation in the surface. And then let's turn on our subdivision surface modifier, disable the wireframes, and we should be able to see a kind of rippling effect, like the shading's all bumping. So the ridges are all bumped, and there's a little bit of a star shape in the warping at the center there. And that's due to a combination of the 3 poles creating all these diamond formations, and just more edges are getting tightly packed in the center there. I've got a similar example on this side, but you can see just the warping is happening at this section. And if we take a look at the wireframe and turn off the subdivisions, we can see that actually here we've just got a simple couple of n-gons, so we might expect further problems in this area, but really it's due to the tight packing of these edges where we're getting the most problems. And it's just the larger amount of edges going into a single vertex, sort of the less space they've got, and so we're more likely to get that kind of issue. Coming back to this 5 and 3 pole example, which is undulating with the displace modifier, I've switched off the subdivision surface modifiers for the moment, just to point out something that you may have noticed already, and that's if we keep an eye on this 5 pole here, you'll notice that even when we do subdivide, it doesn't actually change the positions of those poles. You'll still be able to see exactly where the flow of your topology is actually being turned in various directions. The subdivision surface modifier will turn n-gons, as we noticed here, into quads, but it doesn't get rid of any of the poles. It keeps that direction of flow intact. And with the more subdivisions, so if we enable this second modifier, we can see the poles almost get even more easier to recognize. That was the 5 and 3 example, but the same is true of our 6 poles. We can clearly see them in these areas, and the more densely packed areas here are our 3 poles. The main takeaways are that to keep our poly count low, we're probably going to be needing poles. But so long as we keep our poles sensibly placed and we have access to a pure pole-free mesh to shrink wrap onto, we're probably going to be fine using any poles. Or in other words, be aware of poles, but don't go crazy worrying about them. After all, if you can't see any pinching or warping and the topology isn't super confusing for you to go in and make any changes you might be cooking up, then you're good to go. Sometimes we decide we need more detail in a particular area, so we need to add more edges to make that detail. But the surface we're adding is curved, and we end up flattening out that curvature. So a pretty common example of this is when you have a cylinder and you want to add more edges to it. So if I tab into edit mode here, I've got this top loop selected, and we can see there's 12 edges. So this is a 12-sided cylinder. But what if we wanted to make this, say, twice as much, 24 sides? Well, with such an obviously simple cylinder, it might be best just to delete it and then recreate the cylinder with the correct amount of sides. It's never too late to turn back, you know, sometimes. But as it happens, I'm just going to leave it with this 12. Now, it's not quite as curvy as it was a second ago because I actually had a subdivision surface modifier on there. And I'm going to set this to 2. Let's right click and shade smooth. I'll go full screen again. Tabbing into edit mode, we've still maintained our low amount of geometry to make editing a little bit easier. But thanks to the modifier, we're getting these nice smooth areas. But if for some reason we couldn't just simply delete this and start again, there's a few ways to do it. We might, for example, select everything with A and then right click and then let's subdivide. And then if we leave everything at default, you can probably see, especially if we go from the top orthographic view, press Z and just take a look at the wireframe here, we can see it's not perfectly circular anymore. We're getting this slight flattening out in the middle of each one of those 12 sides. So if we tab into edit mode again, press Z, let's take another look at solid shading. Really what we want is we want all these edges, and we want to be able to press G and kind of curve them out a little bit like that. But we don't want to be hassled with that sort of thing manually. What are our automatic approaches, those options that we've got available to us? So what I've done is I've undone that first subdivide attempt, and all we need to do is try that again, but we're going to set our smoothness up to 1. And we didn't really want this snazzy little belt on this thing, so let's just press X and then dissolve those edges there. And then we've nailed our uniformly distributed edges, and they maintain the curvature perfectly for us. That's a very simple way to use the subdivide tool. We get more flexibility than that really, than just doing a large uniform subdivide and throwing detail everywhere. So let's just quickly explore using that subdivide tool slightly differently. So I've hit Control Alt and left clicked on one of these edges to get the edge ring, and then let's go to select and then checker deselect to get every other one. And then we'll X and dissolve those. So we're back to 12 edges again. And then rather than getting everything with A, I'm just going to take the top and the bottom loop, then right click and then subdivide. And then thanks to our smoothness setting, everything should maintain its curvature. Well, that's very similar to what we had before. Let's undo that and instead just choose to take, say, these 3 edges along with these 3 at the bottom. I feel like selecting them a slightly different way this time. So select loops, edge rings, and now right click and subdivide. So this way we're just getting that extra detail where we wanted it rather than everywhere. There is something to be mindful of this approach though, especially with the subdivision surface modifier, is if we take a look at this from top orthographic and press Z to take a look at our wireframe, you can see this much smoother curved line within the boundary of our low polygonal cylinder that we've got here. We can see where it's lower resolution, it's slightly further away than it is on these extra edges that we've added here. To reveal the true horror of the implications here, let's just tab into object mode, press Shift A, add in a new mesh cylinder. Notice this is a lot higher resolution at 32. We can see by selecting the other cylinder that where we have the higher geometry, it's way closer to this higher resolution one than it is where it's lower resolution. In other words, with the subdivision surface modifier, adding our extra detail in some places is basically going to ruin the perfectly circular nature of it. To drive the message home on this, let's control space to minimize this view. I'm going to turn off this collection and have this prepared cylinders of Terra collection to demonstrate something instead. This selected cylinder here is 8-sided, this one is 12-sided, this one is 24-sided, this one is 48-sided, and we can see as we're going through these, they're getting larger, even though the original construction, the radius of these were all identical. We can even see if we open up our sidebar with the N key, if we check out our actual dimensions of this, this is nearly 2 meters. This one is less, this one less still, this one less again. And perhaps we can almost do a crazy one with cylinder just set to 4. The radius, again, it remains to be the same, but let's bring on our subdivision surface modifier and see it shrink under the awesome weight and responsibility that we've given this 4-sided cylinder to become an actual fully fledged real cylinder. Please do not feel bad though, little 4-sided cylinder, for of course you began as a mighty diamond. Let's take a look at all of these other cylinders. I'll just restrict the visibility of that mighty diamond there. And these are all perfectly circular, just with various different radii. That is until we uncheck what the subdivision surface modifier is doing. And then they all jump back to what they were before at 2 meters diameter. I'm going to alt click that again to set them all back though. And here we have another one, this cylinder chimera, this DNA spliced monstrosity that sits between 2 worlds, or at least varying orbits. So if I tap into the edit mode, we can see the lower resolution going around at the top half and some extra edges down at the bottom there, which of course, as we know now, will draw it further to the outside to its true radius. So where do we stand with those 2 cylinders we were looking at earlier? This one that we've adjusted and this other one that we've got with the 32 sides, which is perfectly circular. We corrected the flattening out of the curvature, but instead we dropped to another circle of hell, so to speak. There is salvation here, but as usual, we're going to need help from some outside force, some other object. And so to help this chimera, this mutant spliced version of low geometry and higher resolution down at this area, we're going to have this 32-sided one carry the weight. Let's name that accordingly actually. Instead of 002, This one's got 32 sides. Now let's return back to our troubled cylinder. And what we'll do to save ourselves here is we'll give this a shrink wrap modifier. And from our target, we'll just find the one with 32 sides. And we can use the defaults here. Let's take a look in solid shading and turn off the visibility of the 32 sided one. Let's take another look from the top back into wireframe, and that's looking good. In fact, if we toggle the visibility of that 32 sided one, we can see it's matching it really nicely. Let's turn that off again though and take another look in solid shading, because we might be able to see that it's not quite right. There's a little bit of waviness in the normals that we can see here. I'm hoping the recording can correctly pick that up. So the main thing to bear in mind here is that what we're doing, the shrink wrapping, it's going to work fine, but we need to be shrink wrapping to something more detailed. Otherwise, we're going to kind of end up flattening up some of our surface all over again. So while this cylinder has this extra subdivisions on, this cylinder 32 doesn't. So let's go and add a subdivision surface to that one. I get up to 2, and then I'm going to turn that one off. And now let's revisit our shading on our mutant cylinder here. And everything is looking fine. Here I've just set our 2 cylinders side by side, the 32 sided one here on the left and the one with the varying geometry on the right. Currently our 32 sided one doesn't show the subdivisions, and we can see that the general amount of geometry that we've got is less than what we had with our hybrid here, the one with the varying amount of detail. So without the subdivision surface modifier, it's clearly lower, but with it, it now exceeds this polygon count. Hence, while we add this, it's going to take it much more comfortably higher than what this is doing. And then it's going to suit our needs perfectly by not flattening any faces out. So we've been looking at cylinders and circular shapes, but what of just generally more curved surfaces? If I tab into edit mode on this, we can see from this point here to this point, there's no more geometry, so it's looking a little flat there. Let's say we had this part and we've just added this in, and we have these extra edges here now, and we need to bring them up. As before, we had our subdivide option, but we can just go Control R and left click those in, right click to drop them in place. And by default, these are just going to be just emphasizing that flatness. But again, with this tool, we also have a smoothness option. So we can just crank that up to 1 and check out the curvature it's given us. Or maybe I'll reduce that slightly, play with the fall off by holding Control and middle mouse wheeling through them. I think the linear one is what I like the most. As for these, I'm just going to hook these up by selecting them and pressing J. Once we have that new geometry, we could maybe try smoothing some of it out if we wanted. In vertex select mode, I'm going to go Control V to bring up our vertex menu and try smoothing the vertices there. I like to just do it once and then Shift R repeatedly, and that's kind of helping smooth that part out. I'm going to undo that though a few times with Control Z, and we'll just take a look at one more tool. So let's take the top loop here, and I'm going to Alt right click on it and come up to the loop tools and then curve. If I toggle the before and the after with Control Z and Control Shift Z, we can see that it's essentially used the top line of vertices as an input, and will attempt to apply that kind of curving to all of the edge loops beneath it until it stops at an imperfect edge loop. In this case, right here, since this loop has these 5 poles on it, or in other words, not all the vertices on the loop have 4 edges connected to each vertex. Or if we didn't want to make such a drastic change, we could maybe take these and right click and then curve, and then it will only affect the rest of that loop. Well, I think I preferred just doing the general sweeping idea of selecting the top edge and then curving the rest. One simple move, and not a flat surface in sight. What if we just want to add detail to a small part of the mesh, but when adding extra loops, we end up with heavy geometry all over the place? Let's take this not very happy chappy here, which should be just a simple divided plane. Let's say that's our starting geometry, and we'd like to add some extra detail in the middle. A common thing to do is just add those extra edge loops cutting right across, so that we have enough detail to do whatever shape or design we have in mind, like this sort of protruding kind of buckle shape. Well, we'd better buckle up, because we're in for a bumpy ride with that sort of approach. Here we have loads of extra geometry in places we don't actually need it. What we want to do is turn back time to the good old days when it was just a simple subdivided plane, and see if we can isolate the extra detail just into the center. Actually, it's pretty easy. We can control the flow of topology and where the detail is using poles. That is to say, a vertex that doesn't have just 4 edges coming from it. So this has got 4 edges, so this isn't a pole. In fact, all of these aren't poles. So to show how the direction can change, let's just quickly make one. So I'm just going to select this face, right click and subdivide, and then I'm going to slide these 2 vertices into the same corner there. So thanks to our auto merge setting up at the top right there, I can just do that and it'll auto merge for me. And now we've created our pole. In fact, we've created 2. This is a 3 pole, this is a 5 pole. And just to make this nice and clear, I'm going to complete the new edge loops that we've created with the knife tool. K to select that vertex, hold Control just to get it nice and neat, and so that all the new points will be in the center. And again, K, left click, hold Control, left click again, and then enter to exit the tool. And if I select 3 to switch to face select, and alt left click this edge here to get the face loop, you can see we've created this kind of elbow and 90-degree turn in our geometry. And those are pretty easy to make with a 5 pole on the outside and a 3 pole on the inside of our corner. So I can select this face over here and just simply press I to inset. And right there, we've just created these 5 poles and these 3 poles on the inside. And that's causing us to have this nice contained circular loop going around. So let's apply that idea to make a kind of buckle shape in the middle here. So I'm going to select this face and then Control Shift click this to get the whole span in between. Breaking out our trusty inset tool, I'm going to press I to inset and then left click to drop that in. Now we could go about this in a number of ways at this point. We can continue to inset, so I could go I again and then I again. And let's say that's now enough geometry, but we're not quite happy with how it's spread out at the moment. It's a little uneven. I'm going to just select across these vertices and then go Control V and then smooth them out. I'm going to increase the smoothing all the way. I'm going to set the repeat up a little bit to say about 5, and that's looking pretty good. I think I'll just scale it out a little bit more with the S key, and I think we're good to go. From there, I can alt left click this loop and then shift selecting these and then E to extrude, and then we've kind of got our buckle shape. In fact, let's jump out of that and put on a subdivision surface modifier just to make it look all nice and slick. I'm going to undo that now though, and we'll do that just a slightly different way. So I'm going to I to inset those so that this middle section is fairly even, then just scale it all in. And then from there, because we have our base loop, which now has this looping direction to it, we can just simply go Control R and add in as many extra loops as we want there. And then we get a much more boxy-like pattern, rather than it being rounded out, if that's the sort of thing that you're going for. Here's another example of creating extra detail, but this time, instead of in the interior, let's put that detail at the edge. The method is basically the same. Here we can see a sort of incorrect version where the geometry runs off all over the model, rather than just contained to the area where we want that extra detail, as shown on the example on the right. We can see the poles here directing the flow into this section to give us the extra desired geometry that we wanted here. Just to duplicate that on this side, I'm going to select this face, Control Shift click this one to get the whole span, and then I'm going to inset again. And so that it doesn't pay attention to the border there, we can just press the B key, which we can see if we keep our eyes up at the top there while we're in the tool. We can toggle that option. And from there, let's just grab these vertices, Control V, smooth them all away. With a repeat of 5 seems good to me. And I'll take these and just scale them in a little bit as well. And similar as we did before, if we want a little extra detail, we can now add in extra loops, or we could even repeat the process by just taking these 2, for example, and then insetting them in again, just to create some extra little detail just right in the center line there. Here's an example just to show that in a production process. If I tab into edit on this model, we can see we have only so many edges going up here, but more edges were required to be able to help this cylindrical detail mesh in correctly. Hence we can kind of see like an inset here where the flow is following around this detail just to be able to maintain the consistent spacing of the various edges used to detail in that cylinder. But there's no reason why these points here would need to be cut in and go up this face loop here, and again with this one. Also note, we can see our friendly neighborhood 5 pole there with the 3 pole next to it, directing the flow into where we need it. Let's take a look at a more 3-dimensional example like these cubes. So this default cube that I've got on the left, very simple, just 6 faces with some flat shading. It doesn't look too bad generally. One of the major complaints here is that these edges are going to be impossibly sharp. And this is where we lose often our realism in our models. They become, for want of a better word, a little bit too computery. Whereas this one, we've got some extra geometry, and therefore this little bevel on the edge, allowing light to shine off it, is a little bit more true to real life. Taking a look at the modifiers on this, all I've done is put the subdivision surface modifier on after a bevel modifier. I'm going to switch off the subdivision surface modifier just to show the wireframe for the results of our bevel modifier. So basically we have our size here, but our profile is set all the way to 1, so it isn't going to try and curve the edges. And this is just a way to try and create extra supporting loops around each edge, so that when we add our subdivision surface modifier, it doesn't completely collapse. Whereas if we were to do that to this one, we lose our shape entirely. And now 6 is 9, and cubes are spheres, and cats and dogs are living together, etc, etc. Here I've got this cube form being extruded out of a subdivided plane, and extra loops are added here around this vertex. Let's just turn off our subdivision surface modifier just to see it very clearly. We have this entire vertex surrounded so that it doesn't lose its shape when we subdivide it. You can see in some places where we don't have the extra loops, it's rounding out with quite a significant impact. So thinking of our poles in this kind of way, how might we save the amount of geometry that we've got here? Well, seeing how we have this detail extruding out from the center of this, what I would like is a face loop to kind of follow this. So let's just turn that off for a second, and Z to get into wireframe. We can see we have this loop that goes all the way around, but the next loop that we have next to it, this one, is just going straight across. So we know we're going to need a pole right here. I'm going to slide that in, double tap G, and double tap G, and now we've made this kind of 5 pole, well actually more. If I go Control 2, it'll switch this to select all of those edges, and we can see there we've got 7 of them. But just to make things a bit simpler, once we've collapsed them, we no longer need that or that edge loop. So I'm going to alt click on them and then X to dissolve them. And now we can see that we have an edge loop going around quite nicely. It runs off over here, but just for simplicity, I'm just going to demo everything on this one corner, as it would be the same process on the others. Now we still have extra detail coming off here, which is not ideal, but again, this is where poles are going to help us. So just to get rid of this stuff, I'm going to take this edge, I'm going to double tap G, I'm going to slide that in, and I'm going to take these 2 edges, double tap G, and slide that in. So now we have this 5 pole. That means though, because of this 5 pole, we have a much larger amount of this ground plane following the loop around our extruded geometry now.
That's not necessarily good or bad, it just depends on your goals. Just to finish it off, let's take a look at it subdivided again.
Tab into object mode just to take another look, and we can see that it isn't having any problems there. It's flowing quite nicely. And I think what I like about this kind of process is that if we wanted to now, we could take that edge loop and begin to slide it further away to alter the kind of join that we might want for our geometry here. Same with the edge loop above it.
So just that little bit of extra thought about how we add our details gives us that extra flexibility, as well as reduces the modeling hell of all those loops running off around the back of the model that we don't even need, increasing our poly count, needlessly increasing the complexity, and in many cases wreaking havoc with the results of our subdivision modifier. As the saying goes, the devil makes use of idle hands, or in this case, unnecessary idle geometry.
Welcome to Modeling Issues from Hell. Let's talk about invisible polygons and weird shading. How many times you noticed something like that? Basically, it's pretty hard to spot, but the shading is a little bit off, and once you add the bevel modifier or do some other mesh operations, you notice that something is definitely off, not only with the shading, but with the topology. Usually it's a double-sided thing, so we can go over to the Viewport Shading tab, enable backface culling, and notice that now some polygons have gone missing. So what's even going on here? Well, once you see the invisible polygons, make sure to check the face orientation, because chances are that some polygons were flipped. And actually, let's disable the backface culling for the moment. And right, the blue polygons are the faces which normals point outwards, like they should, while the red polygons are flipped. Their normals point inwards, and that makes them invisible for the video card. So we can go on normals, recalculate outside, or recalculate inside for that matter, and it will sort it out, or we can just select every red polygon and say, well, flip it. Let's flip those polygons. Now things should go back to norm, and not only visually, in terms of the correct gradients and so on drawn by the video card, but also in terms of the modeling operations. That's a win-win here. It's time to solve that crooked crime. And so it goes like this. You see the mesh with the flat shading, and you go, it's easy. Let's do shade smooth. But this time, no effect. You try that again, and then you go over to the normal step because you think that definitely when you enable auto smooth and change the angle, it should get smoothed out. But it doesn't get smoothed out. Something else is going on here. And to tell you the truth, I suspected it right from the start. The edge split modifier. So what this modifier does is basically, well, splits the edges. So they are disconnected, even though it seems that the mesh is perfectly solid, when in fact it's not. It could look like this when brought from the CAD applications, for example. So it's not necessarily the evil workings of the edge split modifier. Fortunately, there's an easy fix. Let's select all polygons and merge them by distance. And after doing this, we can notice that we removed about 800 vertices. It did the trick in our case, but you may want to increase the merge distance. And you know what? That's a bummer. The mesh looks awful. Learn more about awful things in the next chapters. That one is simple. What if the auto smooth slider isn't responding? Like, you try to control the auto smooth angle, but the angle slider is grayed out and there is no effect once you click and drag it. And what is even more confusing, the auto smooth isn't working, apparently, even though the object has been shaded smooth. What does it all mean? That means that the mesh has a custom set of split normals, and we need to clear them in the Geometry Data tab. So once you clear the custom normals data generated probably by the weighted normals modifier, or simply by adjusting the normals by hand, you get back the control over the auto smooth angle. That's probably a good news, although, you know, you no longer have a custom set of split normals. That being said, sometimes this issue presents itself from a slightly different perspective. Let's say the auto smooth is popped in, but the angle isn't responding, and at the same time there is no custom normals data. What does it mean? Chances are we forgot to simply enable shade smooth in the right mouse button menu. That happens to me all the time. Have you noticed that sometimes smooth shading is a little bit too smooth? That may sound strange, but right out of the box, the default smooth shading algorithm in Blender just makes everything look like jelly. Well, to some extent it can be fixed by decreasing or increasing the auto smooth threshold in the normals tab, and that will tell Blender to not smooth out the edges with the sharpness over 30 degrees or whatever you set in the angle. But of course there is other ways you can do this, and I'm gonna show you some of them in a really quick fashion. First of all, if you have used the bevel modifier, there is the harden normals checkbox in there, so you can just click on it and be happy. It will fortify the bevels and stop excessive smoothness from creeping in. The other way of avoiding the jelly cube smoothness would be to use the weighted normal modifier and set the weight to around 50 or even higher. In brief, even though the default smooth shading or Gouraud shading algorithm of Blender tends to average everything based on the corner angle, the face-weighted alternative almost always looks way better, or at least it looks more faithful to the actual geometry of the mesh. The flat faces remain flat, and the larger is the face, the more weight it gets in the process of calculating normals and their relative weights. So once again, here's what the default smooth shading algorithm does. So to demonstrate it, let's enable this funky looking matcap, but it allows us to debug the weird curvature issue that we see when we use the default smooth shading. Oh gosh, the lines are warped, and it speaks of something. Let's enable the custom split normals display and try to average the normals based on their face area rather than corner angle. Hopefully that will flatten or straighten out the normals, at least for the flat faces, and let the blending happen not across the entire model, but across the smallest faces, in this case the beveled faces. The slightly disturbed bevel normals is the price that we pay for the overall correct normals for the larger faces. It's a good compromise. Now let's wrap it up by comparing two methods. On the right you can see the default one, the corner weighted normals, and on the left you see the improved face weighted normals. The default smoothing algorithm of Blender has its own uses and its own pros, but it has a fatal flaw that it skews the shading of the flat faces, unlike the face-weighted alternative that can be accessed via the hardened normals of the bevel modifier and via the weighted normals modifier itself, and some other ways. In contrast to the popular belief, smooth shading can be a little bit flat. When we talk about the properly face-weighted normals, which is an absolutely brilliant technique of working with normals in Blender and other applications, it can produce a little bit flat results, almost like flat shading, well, to some extent. Especially if you're aiming, for whatever reason, for more stylized look. So first we can clear the custom split normals data if that's the case, if the face weighted normals look a little bit flat, but let's try something different. I'm opening my quick favorites menu and going mesh, normals, average, and previously I have selected face area for this model to face weight the normals, but to roll back the changes I'm gonna press reset vectors. And that will bring the normals back to their initial state, the corner weighted state, the default smooth shading algorithm in Blender, and that looks a little bit more interesting, I would say. Just an extra bit of curvature, a fake curvature, but nevertheless. We can push it even further by going mesh, normals, and selecting smoothen vectors. I'm gonna click it, and to make it slightly more prominent, I'm going to repeat this process a few times by pressing Shift R to repeat the last operation. And believe me, I have pressed this at least 5 times in a row. And so the overall arrangement of the normals here, even though the geometry is still flat, reminds of a sphere a little bit. So that is one of the potential ways out of this situation, when the model looks a little bit flat, even though it should look flat technically, but maybe you want something different, and you can get creative with the normals. Even though most of the time I think we are better off face weighting the normals, occasionally we can pull off something different. How to change the bevel profile without editing polys and without adding any extra modifiers. That's tricky. Here we have a model with a few bevels, and I'm gonna copy it out. And even though in our example we cannot edit anything, if we had such liberty, we could just intervene and, I don't know, create a new sort of bevel by utilizing the proportional fall-off or something like that. We could have shaped this geometry somehow, but what if we cannot do this? Maybe we have a finalized version of a model and we just need to tweak the bevel profile somehow without actually tweaking it. Sounds like a riddle. But actually we can make use of the normal editing tools of Blender. For example, we can select an edge and rotate its per face vertex normals. And by doing it, we kind of change the curvature, at least visually. We change the way the gradient is rendered on those faces. So I wonder if you agree with me. We kind of tightened the top bevel and we can make the bottom bevel slightly more gradual with the help of the adjusted normals. It almost looks like we enhanced the S curve of this profile. And if you wonder what are these violet lines protruding out of the vertices, it's vertex per face normals, which can be enabled in the overlay tab. So here is how to change the bevel profile without touching the geometry and modifiers.
Cutting details into curved surfaces can create some annoying warped shading issues, or often demand a lot of attention to how we're laying out the topology. We can actually get away with quite a lot on a flat surface, but the moment we start bringing in curvature, that's when we start relying on normals to trick the eye into making it look super smooth. And also to help with that, we can add some subdivision surface levels to it. But still, if we go back to shading flat, you can still see that that's actually still a fair amount of illusion.
So going back to shading that smooth there, and it's this attempt at smoothing that can create warping in the shading when we cut in some detail, such as the removal of a few faces.
Which is what I've done here with this mask. So I'm going to turn on that modifier, and we can see now in this area, we're getting a little bit of warping in the shading. Now this sort of metal matte cap that we've got on is fairly rough looking, but the more reflective the surface, the more this would show up. So if we switch our matte cap over to something really brutal, like this horizontal lines here, we'll definitely start to see in these zebras striped pajamas here that all is not looking quite right. And if we bring those faces back by disabling this modifier, we'll see how normally smooth they go. And this isn't just because we have the subdivision surface modifier moving our vertices around a little bit. If we actually disable this, we'll still see that kind of warping happening when we toggle on and off our mask. Alright, so I'm going to disable the mask modifier. I'm going to enable the subdivision surface modifier. And then what I'm going to do to fix this, or to make things go way easier for us at least, is just duplicate it. So Shift D to duplicate that, right click to leave it into place. So now we have this copy of this pure one. I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to call this fix. We don't need to see the pure one, so I'm going to disable the visibility of that. And so now we're just looking at the cylinder.fix. I'm going to delete that mask. That was just for demo purposes. And what we're going to do instead is add in a shrink wrap modifier, and our pure one is going to be the target. The other settings we can leave just as they are. And now what that means is that we can make edits to this and maintain a lot more of this smooth shading way easier. For example, let's go over and delete some of these faces here. With X, we can see that the lines are flowing way smoother across this. That is certainly in comparison to how it looks if we disable the modifier. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo until we get our faces back. And instead of just deleting them like this, I'm going to just inset them first a little bit with the I key. Let's take a look with material preview just to show that a little bit. So now we have this face loop going around.
I think I'll make it larger though, so I'll undo that and then inset again with the I key.
And then X to delete. Now let's take a look back over with solid shading where we've got our matte cap. We can see it's still flowing pretty smoothly throughout that space, throughout that hole. Now the main reason I like to have this face loop which goes around the hole here is because it gives us a little bit more control about how this looks. Because now what we can do is we can double tap G and slide this a little bit and change the overall size. Another thing that we can do is come to our corners here, and instead of it being kind of curved as it goes around, we can go Shift E and 1 and turn that into a very sharp corner. In this instance though, what I think I'd like to do is just, I'll leave one part of it sharp and this side I'll keep rounded. So I'll go Shift E and go -1. Just to clear that out to 0. We can check an edge is creasing, so by just selecting it and pressing N, and we can see the edge data value of this one is set to 1 and this one is set to 0.
At the moment, our mesh is impossibly thin, so let's give it more interest by giving it some thickness. Let's create a little more space in here by minimizing these, and then go Add Modifier and give this some solidification.
I'll tab back into object mode and we can just about see a bit of thickness there. I'll come back over to solid shading and let's switch from this matte cap now over to this one. I'm going to thicken this up a little bit more, somewhere around there, and that's all good. And then also let's give it a bevel modifier. Don't want to bevel absolutely everything though. I just want to bevel things at a certain angle. 30 degrees might be fine, but the offset's a little bit large at the moment. So I'm going to hold Shift while dragging on this value to set it pretty low there. And let's give it a few more segments, something like 3. So now we're getting some nice highlighted edges. The other thing that I'm going to change on this, if we get really close in and take a look at the wireframe, I'm just going to change this kind of area here from being sharp to being a patch. And I find that that just gives it a slightly smoother look. going around those corners there. Another option with this modifier is that we can always try our harden normals. That should give us some nice shading for typical hard surface objects, and then we're good to go and ready to easily add details to this. So a couple of very simple things that we could do is delete the ends of these, X to delete those faces, and now we have a bit more of a hollow piece of metal, or something like that anyway. Something else we can do is take our pure cylinder there, just turn it on for a second, make sure we have it selected, and then we can duplicate that again with Shift D. And then let's just rename this as, I'm going to call this the Pure Core. And what I'll do for this one is I'm going to give it a displace modifier. Basically that's going to shoot out on the normal direction and grow it slightly. But if we take this down and kind of go inside a little bit into the negative numbers, we'll be able to push it in. So I'm going to disable the view of that pure one again, and we can see what this is doing a little bit clearer. I'm just looking for the displace modifier to shrink the model itself so as to reveal what our solidify modifier is doing. And now we can return back to our cylinder.fix and add in more details. At this point, we're kind of off the leash. So I can go Control Alt and Space and kind of go into a super expert mode, tab into edit mode, make sure we're in face select mode, and then grab, say, a portion of the faces like this. And we could separate them with Y, and that's going to create a very, very slight gap thanks to our bevel modifier. But the vertices are still pretty much sat on top of each other. I'm going to undo that, and instead I'm going to go I and inset a little bit like about there. And then Control R, scroll the mouse wheel to add an extra couple of loops. 3 to switch to face select so that I can alt click on this edge there to get that face loop. And then X to delete those faces. And now we've got a kind of a wider panel line there. Let's tab back in and keep going. Z to toggle the wireframe here, as I think I'll just select all of these faces. Z to go back into solid shading, so that we've got all the way around really easily there. I think I'll deselect some of these though, like that, maybe on the other side as well. And with that selection, I'm going to press I to inset, but I don't want to be insetting on this border here. So I'm going to make sure that I press I and B to disable insetting on the border, and that's created another face loop here for us. So with that, I'm going to press Control R and do another couple of loops. 3 to switch to face select, and then Alt left click this edge to get that loop, and then delete. And now we have this kind of detail. If we wanted some sharper lines there, we can tab into edit mode and just come through to this area and select those edges that are on the very corners and go Shift E and then 1. And that's going to sharpen them right out for us. And honestly, we don't actually have to even be that precise with this. We can just go Control R, add in a loop somewhere, Control B to bevel that, add in an extra couple of edges with the mouse wheel so that we can just go in easily, select our face loop, and X to delete it. That's all good to go. Control Alt and Space to exit that view, and we can just test it occasionally with our super stripy material, and you'll see that all the normals are passing through it really nicely. But certain matte caps are going to make it easier to work than others, clearly. Here I have another example, which is basically the very same setup as before. If we take a look at the topology in edit mode, we'll see how loose some of the modeling actually is, while the shading is still looking really nice. For example, check out these end guns here, but they're shading perfectly nice. In fact, let's get our screaming judgmental zebra on there. Actually, also check out this hole that we have. I'm going to select the edge loop there for that, and we can see the lines are passing through completely fine there, despite making it clearer with this matte cap that there isn't actually any face loop that kind of borders the hole. That kind of brings me to another point, because if I take this vertex and I want to control how this edge is looking, I could use creasing on one of these edges, or I could use Control Shift and B to bevel a vertex rather than an edge. However, I'm going to right click that because the way I prefer to go about this is to bevel an edge instead. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to Alt left click this loop here, press E to extrude an extra loop, right click to leave it in place, and I'm going to scale that one in a little bit to about there. And now instead of a vertex, we've got this edge which goes into the corner. It's a little bit tricky to see exactly with the subdivision surface modifier still on, so I'm going to disable that a second, and we can see the edge in question there, just this one going into the corner. And then what we can do is Control B to bevel that and use the mouse